The deed in my hands had my brother's name on it. That part didn't surprise me anymore. What I couldn't explain was the second document the county clerk slid across the counter, dated years before my father ever claimed ownership. If my dad didn't legally control the farm back then, how did he give it away? And why had no one ever mentioned a trust tied to my grandfather's name? "I can pull the full chain of title," the clerk said quietly. "But you might not like what you find." I remember staring at that paper, realizing the story I'd been told my entire life might not just be unfair, it might be built on something that was never true to begin with. If you're watching this from somewhere outside the US, tell me where you're from. I'm always curious how family stories like this play out in different places. And what time is it where you are right now? Also, if you've ever been told something was for the family, but it didn't feel right, I'd really want to hear that too. You can subscribe if you want to follow what happened next. I grew up believing the farm would choose me back if I proved I belonged to it. That's how my father always framed it. Not as an inheritance, not as a gift, something closer to a test. Land remembers who takes care of it, Hector Ramos used to say, standing at the edge of the soybean fields with his hands on his hips. It doesn't care about titles, it cares about who shows up. I showed up. Long before I understood anything about property law or trust structures, I understood routines. I knew how early the sun had to be before you could safely irrigate without scorching the leaves. I knew which parts of the soil held water too long after a storm. I knew the difference between doing something fast and doing it right. Daniel didn't. My brother treated the farm like it was already his. He'd show up late, leave early, and somehow still get praised for helping out. At dinner, my father would talk about him like he was already carrying the weight of everything. "Daniel's got a good instinct for business," he'd say, even when Daniel hadn't set foot outside all day. I'd sit there quietly, still smelling like dirt and fertilizer, waiting for him to notice what I had done. Most of the time, he didn't. My mother, Sophia, stayed out of it. She wasn't cold, just careful. If I asked her directly, she'd give me the same answer every time. "Your father has a plan," she'd say. "You just have to trust it." That word trust meant something very different to me back then. Because from my side, there was no plan. There were just patterns, and the pattern was always the same. I worked. Daniel was seen. There were small moments that stuck with me more than the big ones, like the time a piece of equipment broke down during harvest season. I stayed up most of the night figuring out how to get it running again with what we had. The next morning, my father nodded once and said, "Good, that's what we need." That was it. A week later, Daniel suggested we look into leasing a portion of the land to reduce workload. My father leaned forward like he'd just heard something brilliant. "That's thinking ahead," he said. "That's how you protect what matters." I remember looking at Daniel, then at my father, trying to understand how the same idea could be treated so differently depending on who said it. But I didn't argue. I never did. Instead, I doubled down. I started taking online courses in agricultural management after my shifts. I tracked yields expenses and seasonal changes in a notebook I kept hidden in my room. I built projections. Nothing fancy, just enough to understand where things could go if they were handled right. I thought if I could show him, really show him that I wasn't just working hard but thinking long-term, something would shift. For a while, it almost felt like it did. My father started asking me questions. Not many, but enough to keep me hopeful. What would you plant differently next season? How would you handle labor costs if we expanded? They were small openings, but I treated them like doors. Daniel noticed too. "You're trying too hard," he told me one night, leaning against the kitchen counter while I was going over numbers. "It's not that serious." "It is to me," I said. He shrugged. "It doesn't have to be. Dad already knows what he's doing." That line stayed with me longer than it should have, because deep down I wanted to believe that my father did know what he was doing. that there was some larger logic I couldn't see yet, that all of this, the uneven praise, the vague promises, would make sense eventually. Every now and then my father would reinforce that belief just enough to keep me in place. "This farm stays in the family," he'd say. "That's non-negotiable." But then he'd add something else, something that always felt just slightly out of reach. "And it goes to the one who can carry it forward, not just physically, mentally, financially." I held on to that second part, because if that was the real rule, I had a chance. Years passed like that, not dramatically, just quietly, steadily building a version of the future in my head that depended on effort being enough. Looking back now, I can see how carefully that idea was constructed. It kept me working, it kept me invested, and it kept me from asking the one question that might have changed everything sooner. Was this ever actually a competition, or had the outcome already been decided long before I knew there were rules? The night my father called both of us into the dining room, I thought I was about to find out. He didn't sit down right away, just stood at the head of the table, one hand resting on the back of the chair like he was steadying himself. "Both of you," he said. "Sit." Daniel dropped into his chair without a second thought. I hesitated for half the second, then followed. There was a folder on the table, thick, official looking. I remember noticing the edges first slightly worn, like it had been opened more than once. My father placed his hand on top of it. "We need to talk about the future of the farm." Something in the way he said it made my chest tighten. Not nervous. Not yet. Just aware. Because for the first time, it didn't feel like a conversation. It felt like a conclusion. My father didn't sit down until both of us were quiet. He opened the folder slowly, like the moment needed weight, like it needed to feel official. "This isn't easy," Hector Ramos said, though nothing in his voice suggested hesitation. "But it's necessary." Daniel leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, already relaxed. I stayed still, hands folded in my lap, trying to read something, anything in my father's expression. "There's been a lot of discussion about the future of the farm," he continued. "What it needs, who's best positioned to take it forward." I felt my pulse pick up, but I kept my face neutral. "This isn't about effort alone," he said. "It's about stability, long-term vision, commitment to staying." I didn't interrupt. I didn't ask questions. I waited. Then he slid a document across the table. "To Daniel." That was it. No build-up. No explanation beyond the words he had already decided were enough. Daniel didn't even reach for the paper right away. He just nodded once, like something had been confirmed, not given. I looked down at the document. Deed transfer. The legal language was dense but clear enough. Ownership of the farm transferred to Daniel Ramos. Something in my chest tightened, not sharply but steadily, like a slow pressure building behind my ribs. "I don't understand," I said finally. My voice came out calmer than I expected. "You said I said what I needed to say to keep things moving." My father cut in, not unkindly, but without room for argument. "You've done good work, Gabriella, but you're not building your life here." I blinked. "I've been here every day. Physically, yes." He leaned forward slightly. "But mentally, you're already halfway out. Chicago courses plans. That's not a criticism, it's just reality. That doesn't mean I don't care about the farm. I know you care," he said. "But caring and committing are different things." Daniel finally picked up the document, flipping through it like he was reviewing something routine. "This makes sense," he said almost casually. "We need consistency, not split focus." I looked at him. "You've barely been involved." "That's not true," he replied, meeting my eyes without flinching. "I've been thinking about scaling, about partnerships, about making this sustainable." "You mean leasing parts of it out?" I asked. He shrugged. That's one option. I turned back to my father. That's not how you taught us to run this. My father exhaled slowly, like he had expected this moment and already grown tired of it. Times change, he said. Adaptation is part of survival, and I'm not capable of that. That's not what I said. It's what you're doing. Silence settled over the table, thick but controlled. For a second, just a second, I thought he might reconsider, that he might soften, clarify, adjust something. Instead, he reached back into the folder and pulled out another sheet. This has already been reviewed, he said, placing it beside the deed. By Mr. Collins. The family attorney sitting quietly at the end of the table nodded once. Everything is in order, he said. The transfer is valid. Valid. That word landed harder than the rest, because it meant this wasn't just a decision. It was a completed action. I leaned forward slightly, scanning the page more carefully this time. The signatures were there. My father's, Daniel's, and a date. I frowned. Then I looked again. The meeting we were having, it was happening now. But the date on the document was from 3 months earlier. I didn't say anything right away. I just stared at it, letting the numbers settle into something real. 3 months. Which meant this wasn't a decision my father had come to recently. It wasn't something he had been weighing while watching us work. It had already been decided, signed, finalized, and then presented. Like this. I looked up slowly. When was this actually done? I asked. My father didn't answer immediately. Daniel did. A while ago, he said. Dad wanted to make sure everything was handled properly before bringing it up. Before bringing it up, I repeated, my voice still steady but quieter now. You mean before telling me? It wasn't about you, Daniel said. I let out a small breath. It was always about me. That was the part none of them seemed willing to acknowledge. The years of work, the expectation, the framing of it as something to be earned. If the decision had been made months ago, then everything after that, the questions, the small acknowledgments, the way my father had kept asking for my input, none of it had been real. I turned back to the document, tracing the date with my finger like it might change if I looked at it long enough. It didn't. And then something else caught my attention. A reference line. Small. Easy to miss. It mentioned a prior transfer. Not in detail. Just enough to indicate that this deed wasn't the first movement tied to the property. I frowned slightly. What's this? I asked, tapping the line. Mr. Collins leaned forward to look. That's just a standard reference to earlier records, he said. Nothing you need to worry about. Nothing you need to worry about. That phrase sat wrong with me, because if there was one thing I had learned from watching how this conversation unfolded, it was that the details people told you not to worry about were usually the ones that mattered. I sat back slowly, folding my hands again. Okay, I said. My father studied me for a moment like he was trying to read whether I was about to push or accept. I didn't do either. Not yet. Because something had shifted. The hurt was still there. The disappointment too. But underneath it something quieter had started to form. A question. Not about fairness. Not about whether I deserved the farm. But about whether the story I had been given about it, who owned it, who controlled it, who had the right to transfer it, was actually true. I looked at the document one last time before sliding it back across the table. If everything's already decided, I said calmly, then I guess there's nothing left to discuss. My father nodded once. That's right. But as I stood up, I couldn't shake the feeling that the conversation hadn't ended. It had just moved somewhere else, somewhere written down, somewhere recorded, somewhere I hadn't been meant to look. I didn't confront anyone after that dinner. I went back to Chicago the next morning, packed a bag like I always did, and left before anyone else woke up. No goodbye, no argument, just distance. For the first few days, I told myself I was done with it, that maybe my father was right. Maybe I had already outgrown the farm. Maybe the version of me that wanted it had been replaced by someone who could build something else. But the problem with that idea was simple. If I had truly moved on, I wouldn't have kept thinking about the date on that document. 3 months. It kept coming back to me at the worst times on the train, in the middle of meetings while I was trying to sleep. Not the decision itself, the timing of it. Because once you notice something like that, you can't unsee it. And once you start questioning one detail, everything else starts to loosen. I didn't go back to the farm, but I did start asking questions. Not out loud, not to my family, on paper. The first thing I did was call Maya. She picked up on the second ring. "Hey, you okay? Do you know how to pull a full chain of title?" I asked. There was a pause. "That's specific. I just need to understand something." Another pause, shorter this time. Then, "Okay, yeah, I can walk you through it." "What are you looking at?" "A property transfer," I said. "Family-owned land. But I think there was something before the transfer that no one told me about." "That happens more than you think," she said, "especially with older properties. People set things up through trusts, partial transfers, conditional deeds, stuff that doesn't always show up in the story families tell." "That's exactly what this feels like," I said. "All right," she replied. "Start with the county records office. Everything that's been officially recorded will be there. You're looking for a chain, every transfer, every lien, every change in ownership. It's public information. Public." That word settled differently now, because if it was public, then it wasn't hidden. It was just ignored or avoided. That afternoon, I took a half day off work and went to the county records office in Cook County first, just to understand the system. The clerk there showed me how everything was indexed by parcel number, by owner name, by date. Once I understood the structure, I drove out to the county where the farm was actually located. Smaller office. Quieter. The kind of place where records didn't just sit in a database. They existed in physical files, scanned copies, old entries that had been transferred from paper to digital over time. The clerk looked at me for a second when I gave her the parcel number. "Family property?" she asked. "Something like that." She nodded like she'd heard that answer before. It took a while. Not because the records were hidden, but because they were layered. Each transfer led to another reference. Each reference pointed to something earlier, a sequence of decisions stretching back further than I expected. At first, everything matched what I had been told. The farm had been under my grandfather's name, Luis Ramos. Then at some point it transferred, but not directly to my father. That's where things shifted. There was an entry easy to miss if you weren't looking closely, a transfer into a trust. The name caught my attention immediately, Ramos Agricultural Trust. I leaned in a little closer to the screen, reading the date. It was established before my grandfather passed, which meant this wasn't something my father had set up afterward. It was intentional, planned. I requested the associated documents. The clerk printed what she could and pulled a scanned copy of an older file for the rest. "Some of these older deeds have references that don't show up clearly in the system," she said. "If you're looking for full context, you'll want everything tied to that trust." "I do," I said. When she handed me the documents, I didn't read them right away. I just held them for a second, because something had already changed. The story I had grown up with was simple. My grandfather owned the land. He passed it to my father. My father decided who it went to next. Clean, direct, final. But this wasn't that. This was something structured, something with layers, and layers meant conditions. I sat down at one of the small desks in the corner and started reading. The language wasn't easy, but it wasn't impossible either. Trust formation, named trustee, designated beneficiaries. My grandfather hadn't just handed the farm over. He had placed it into a system designed to control how it would be used, and who would control it. I kept going slower now, because buried in the middle of the document, there was a reference to a subsequent deed, a transfer tied to the trust. Not a full ownership transfer, a conditional one. I felt my focus sharpen. This had to be what the clerk in the opening moment had meant. The prior chain. I flipped to the next page, and there it was. A recorded deed, older than the one my father had presented at dinner. Older by years. It listed the farm, it listed the trust, and it listed the terms. I didn't fully understand all of it yet, but I understood enough to know this wasn't a simple handoff. There were rules, requirements, limitations. The kind of things that don't just disappear because someone decides to ignore them. I sat back slightly, letting that sink in. Because if those conditions still mattered, if they had never been properly resolved, then my father's transfer to Daniel might not be as final as he believed, or as valid as he claimed. I looked down at the page again, this time more carefully. There was a section toward the bottom labeled in a way that stood out even without fully understanding the legal language. Reversion clause. I didn't read it all at once, just the first line. And even that was enough to make my stomach tighten, because whatever this clause said, it wasn't written for convenience. It was written for control. And for the first time since that dinner, I felt something different than anger. Not hope. Not yet. But direction. Because the question wasn't just whether my father had been unfair, it was whether he had been wrong, and that was something I could actually prove. I went back to the counter with the document still in my hand. I think I'm missing part of this, I said to the clerk. There's a reference here to a subsequent deed tied to the trust. It's not fully included. She took the papers, scanned them quickly, then nodded. Yeah, that happens with older filings. Some of these were recorded separately and just cross-referenced. Give me a second. She disappeared into a back room. I stayed where I was, fingers resting on the edge of the counter, trying not to jump ahead of myself. Because I had done that before. I had seen patterns where I wanted answers filled in gaps with assumptions. That wasn't what this needed. This needed clarity. When the clerk came back, she had a thin folder in her hand. This should be what you're looking for, she said, setting it down between us. It's not labeled clearly in the system, but it matches the reference number. Thank you. I took it to the same desk in the corner and sat down again. The paper felt older than the rest. Not fragile, just handled. Like it had existed quietly for years without needing attention. I opened it slowly. The first page confirmed what I had already started to suspect. This wasn't a full transfer of ownership. It was a conditional deed. The farm had been transferred out of the trust, but not completely. Not freely. The language made that clear almost immediately. I leaned forward, reading line by line, forcing myself not to rush. The grantor, the Ramos Agricultural Trust. The grantee, Hector Ramos. So my father had received the property, but only under certain terms. I kept going. The deed specified operational conditions. Requirements tied to how the land was used, who managed it, and what could or couldn't be done with it. It wasn't written in plain language, but the structure was consistent. Maintain agricultural use. Active oversight by the named grantee. Restrictions on leasing or transferring operational control to third parties without approval. I paused there. Leasing. That word hit differently now, because I remembered exactly what Daniel had said at dinner. Scaling. Partnerships. At the time, it had sounded like strategy. Now it sounded like a potential violation. I flipped to the next page. That's where I found it. The reversion clause. It wasn't dramatic. No bold text, no warning signs. Just a section written in the same steady legal tone as everything else. But the meaning was clear once I worked through it. If the conditions of the deed were not met, if the land was not maintained under the required structure, then the ownership interest could revert. Not to my father, not to whoever held the current deed, back to the trust. I sat there for a moment reading it again, and then again, because it didn't just change the situation, it changed the entire framework. My father hadn't been given full control. He had been given responsibility, and responsibility came with limits. I turned back a few pages, checking the dates. The conditional deed had been recorded years before the document my father presented at dinner, which meant something very specific. The newer deed, the one transferring the farm to Daniel, was built on top of this one. It didn't replace it. It depended on it. And if the conditions underneath were broken, then everything built on top of it could be unstable. I leaned back slightly, letting the logic settle. This wasn't about fairness anymore. It was about structure. My father had acted like the farm was his to give. But legally, he might not have had that kind of freedom, not without meeting the conditions first. I looked down at the clause again, tracing the language more carefully this time. There was another detail I hadn't noticed at first. The reversion wasn't automatic. It required recognition, documentation, a formal acknowledgement that the conditions had been violated, which meant one thing. Even if Daniel had already crossed the line, even if my father had ignored the rules, nothing would change unless someone brought it forward, unless someone proved it. I closed the folder slowly, because that part was on me now. Not emotionally, not as a daughter trying to correct something unfair, but as someone who understood what the documents actually said and what they allowed. I gathered the papers, organizing them in a way that made sense. Original trust, conditional deed, recent transfer, chain of title. For the first time, the pieces weren't scattered. They connected. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to point in a direction. I walked back to the counter one last time. "Can I get certified copies of these?" I asked. The clerk nodded. "Of course. It'll take a few minutes." While she processed the request, I stood there quietly watching people come and go. No one paid attention to what I was holding. To them, it was just paperwork. To me, it was something else. It was proof that the story I had been told wasn't just incomplete. It was controlled, carefully shaped to make certain choices feel inevitable, to make my father's authority seem absolute, to make Daniel's position look secure. But authority built on conditions isn't absolute, and security built on assumptions isn't permanent. When the clerk handed me the certified copies, I thanked her and stepped outside. The air felt different. Not lighter, just clearer, because now I wasn't guessing anymore. I wasn't reacting to what my father had decided. I was working with what had actually been established. And there was a difference between those two things, a big one. I got into my car, placed the documents carefully on the passenger seat, and sat there for a moment before starting the engine. Because the next step wasn't about reading, it was about interpretation. An interpretation done wrong could undo everything. Done right, it could shift control, but only if I could answer one question first. Not whether Daniel had violated the conditions, but whether I could prove it in a way that mattered. I didn't try to interpret the documents on my own, not beyond what I already understood. Because there's a difference between reading something and being able to defend what it means. And if this was going to matter, if I was going to challenge what my father had done, it had to be precise. That's why I called Rebecca Lawson. Maya had given me her name earlier that evening. She's good with real estate disputes, she'd said, and she doesn't get distracted by family dynamics. That was exactly what I needed. Rebecca's office was in a quiet building just outside downtown Chicago. No oversized lobby, no unnecessary decoration, just a clean space that felt built for focus. She didn't waste time with small talk. "Walk me through it," she said once we were seated. So I did. From the dinner, to the date on the deed, to the trust, to the conditional transfer, to the reversion clause. I laid everything out in order, then slid the documents across the desk. She didn't interrupt while I spoke, and she didn't react immediately when I finished. She just started reading, slowly, methodically, page by page. Every now and then she'd underline something or make a small note in the margin. Nothing dramatic, just enough to mark where her attention had shifted. I sat there watching her work, trying not to fill the silence, because this part mattered more than anything I could say. After about 20 minutes, she closed the folder and leaned back slightly. "Okay," she said. "You're right to question this." That wasn't relief. Not yet. It was confirmation that I wasn't imagining things. "What does that actually mean?" I asked. "It means your father didn't receive full unrestricted ownership of the property," she said. "He received a conditional interest from the trust." I nodded. That's what I thought. And those conditions are still active unless they were formally released or satisfied, she continued. There's no indication here that they were, so he couldn't just transfer it. "Not freely," she said. "Any transfer he made would still be subject to the original conditions. Think of it like building on top of a foundation. If the foundation has rules, everything above it has to follow them." I let that settle for a second. "Okay," I said. "So if those rules are broken—" She didn't let me finish. "Then the interest can revert," she said, "back to the trust. Not to me. Back to the trust." That distinction mattered. "So even if I prove there's a violation," I said, "it doesn't automatically become mine." "Correct," she said. "It goes back to the structure your grandfather set up." I leaned forward slightly. "And then what?" "That depends on the trust terms," she replied. "But based on what I'm seeing, there are designated beneficiaries." I thought about the document I had read. "There are," I said, "but I didn't fully understand how that part works." "We can go through that," she said. "But before we do, there's a more immediate question." I already knew what it was. "Whether there's a violation," I said. She nodded once. "Exactly." I exhaled slowly. "I think there is," I said. "Daniel mentioned leasing part of the land, and when I was there last, I saw signs of third-party equipment." Rebecca didn't react right away. "Seeing signs isn't enough," she said. "We need documentation, contracts, payments, anything that shows operational control has been transferred in a way that violates the deed." "I can get that," I said, maybe a little too quickly. She watched me for a second. "Be careful," she said. "This isn't about catching someone in a mistake. It's about building a case that holds up if it's challenged." "I understand." "Do you?" she asked, not aggressively, just directly, "because once you move forward with this, it stops being a family disagreement. It becomes a legal dispute." I didn't answer immediately, because she was right. Up until now, everything had existed in a gray space. Hurt feelings, unfair decisions, unspoken expectations. This would be different. This would be formal, documented, irreversible in a way that conversations weren't. "I'm not doing this to take something from him," I said finally. "I just need to understand what's actually mine to question." Rebecca nodded slightly. "That's a better place to start from." She reached for the documents again, flipping to the section with the reversion clause. "There's another detail here you need to be aware of," she said. I leaned in. "The reversion doesn't trigger automatically," she continued. "It has to be asserted, recognized, usually through a formal process. So, even if Daniel's in violation, nothing changes unless someone pushes it forward. Exactly. And that someone would be... She looked at me for a second. Potentially you, she said, depending on your standing within the trust. There it was again. Standing. Position. Not emotion. Not history. Structure. Can we confirm that? I asked. We can, she said, but it'll take a deeper look at the trust documents and possibly additional filings. I nodded. Do it, I said. She made another note, then looked back up at me. One more thing, she added. What if your brother is leasing the land or otherwise transferring operational control? That's not just a technical violation, it's a material one, meaning it strengthens the case for reversion, she said. Significantly. I felt something shift at that. Not excitement, not satisfaction, just clarity. Because for the first time, the situation wasn't abstract. It had direction. A path, but it also had weight, because proving a violation wouldn't just challenge what my father had done, it would undo it. And once something like that starts, it doesn't stop halfway. Rebecca closed the folder again. Get me proof of how land is being used, she said. Not what you think is happening, what you can show. I stood up, gathering the documents. I will, I said. As I walked out of her office, the city felt louder than usual, more structured, more defined. Maybe that was just me, because now I wasn't looking at the farm as something I had lost. I was looking at it as something governed by rules, rules that had been ignored, rules that could still be enforced. But only if I could answer one question clearly enough to stand in front of someone else and say it without hesitation. Not just that Daniel had crossed a line, but exactly where that line was, and exactly how he had crossed it. I didn't go back to the farm right away, not because I didn't want to, because I needed to know exactly what I was looking for before I stepped onto that land again. Guessing wouldn't help me. Observing would. So I started small. I drove out on a weekday afternoon unannounced. Not during harvest season, not during anything that would draw attention. Just a quiet stretch of time when operations would either look normal or reveal what had changed. The road leading up to the farm felt the same. Same gravel crunch under the tires. Same fence line. Same field stretching out farther than memory ever quite captured. For a second, I let myself believe nothing had changed. Then I noticed the equipment. It wasn't ours. Not just new or different. Different branding. Different configuration. Larger, more standardized. The kind of machinery you see when land is being run at scale, not managed by a single family. I parked farther down than I used to, out of direct view of the house. I didn't want to walk in like I belonged there. Not yet. Instead, I stayed near the edge of the field and watched. There were workers moving across the property, but I didn't recognize them. No familiar faces. No one who had grown up around here. No one who knew the rhythms of this place the way we had. They moved efficiently, too efficiently, like they weren't working with the land, they were working through it. I pulled out my phone not to take pictures right away, but to note details. Company logos on the side of the trucks. License plates, equipment IDs, anything that could be traced back later. Because Rebecca had been clear about one thing. Observation wasn't enough. It had to be documented. I walked a little closer, keeping my distance, but close enough to hear pieces of conversation. Rotation schedule's been locked in through next quarter. Corporate wants yield reports every 2 weeks. Corporate. That word didn't belong here. Not in the way my grandfather had built this place. Not in the way my father had always claimed it should be run. I took a few photos then, not of people's faces, just the equipment, the trucks, the layout of how things were being managed. Proof of presence, proof of scale, proof that this wasn't a small temporary arrangement. It was structured, planned, and most likely contracted. I was about to step back toward my car when I heard my name. Gabriella. I turned. Daniel was walking toward me from the direction of the house. He didn't look surprised. He looked prepared.
"Didn't think you'd come back,"
he said, stopping a few feet away.
"I didn't think you'd change everything this fast,"
I replied. He glanced over his shoulder at the fields, then back at me.
"This is what progress looks like,"
he said. Leasing out the land, I asked. Partnering, he corrected. There's a difference. Is there? I said. Because it looks like someone else is running operations. They're optimizing operations, he said. We still own the land.
We.
That word almost made me laugh. You're not even trying to hide it, I said. Hide what, he asked, his tone sharpening slightly.
That you handed control to a third party.
He exhaled slowly like I was being difficult on purpose.
You're stuck on the wrong details, he said. This is how you make something like this sustainable.
You think Dad wanted to keep doing everything the old way forever. This wasn't about the old way, I said. It was about how the land is supposed to be managed, according to who he shot back. I held his gaze. According to the documents, I said. That landed. Not visibly, but just enough. He shifted his weight, glancing again toward the workers in the distance. You've been digging, he said.
I've been reading,
I replied.
Same thing?
Not really. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then he stepped a little closer.
Look,
he said, lowering his voice.
I don't know what you think you found, but whatever it is, it's not going to change anything.
You sound pretty sure about that. Because I am, he said. Dad handled this. Legally.
Did he?
I asked. Daniel's expression tightened slightly.
Don't do this,
he said. Don't turn this into something it doesn't need to be. I didn't turn it into anything, I replied. I just stopped accepting what I was told without checking it. That's exactly what I mean, he said. You always need to prove something. Always need to question everything. Maybe I just need things to make sense. They do make sense, he said. You just don't like the outcome. I let that sit for a second. Then I asked the question I had been holding back. Who's the company? I said, nodding toward the equipment. Daniel didn't answer right away.
It doesn't matter,
he said finally.
It does if they're involved in operations.
They're consultants, with their own machinery, their own crew, their own reporting structure. He didn't respond, and that silence said more than anything else. I took another step back, putting a little more distance between us. Do you have a contract with them? I asked.
Of course I do,
he said a little too quickly.
Can I see it? No.
That answer didn't surprise me, but it confirmed what I needed. Because if there was a contract, if operational control had been formally handed over, then this wasn't just a gray area. It was exactly what the conditional deed had warned against. Daniel seemed to realize that a second too late.
You're not entitled to that, he added. I'm not asking for it as your sister,
I said. That made him pause. Then what are you asking, as he said? I held his gaze for a second longer than necessary. I'm not asking, I said quietly. Not anymore. Because at this point I didn't need his permission. I had what I needed from this visit. Not the contract itself, but enough to show that one existed. Enough to show that control had shifted. Enough to start connecting what I had seen to what I had read. Daniel shook his head slightly, like he was trying to dismiss the entire interaction.
You're overcomplicating this,
he said.
Am I?
I replied. He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped back, signaling the conversation was over.
Just Let it go, Gabriella, he said. You've got your life. I've got mine. This doesn't need to turn into something ugly. I watched him walk away, and for a moment I understood what he was really saying. Not let it go. Let it stay the way it is. Let the version of the story they created remain intact. But that version didn't hold up anymore. Not against documents. Not against what I had just seen. I turned back toward my car, taking one last look at the fields, at the machines, at the people who didn't belong to this place but were now running it. And I realized something that shifted everything just a little further. This wasn't hidden. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't even particularly careful, which meant one thing. They weren't worried about being challenged. They didn't think anyone would. And that assumption, more than anything else, was about to become their biggest mistake. I didn't go home after that. Not right away. I drove straight back to Chicago and called Rebecca from the car before I even turned the engine off. I think I have enough, I said. There was a pause on the other end. Tell me exactly what you saw. So I did. The equipment. The workers. The mention of corporate reporting. Daniel's admission careless but clear enough that there was a contract in place. Rebecca didn't interrupt. When I finished, she asked one question. Did you document any of it? Yes, I said. Photos, equipment branding, license plates, layout. I also heard them referencing a rotation schedule and reporting requirements. Good, she said. That helps. Helps. Not confirms, not proves, just helps. That's not enough on its own, is it? I asked. No, she said. But it's a strong start. What you've described suggests operational control has been transferred, but we still need something formal. A contract, payment records, or confirmation from a third party. I leaned back in the seat, staring through the windshield. I asked Daniel directly, I said. He admitted there's a contract, but he wouldn't show it. I'm not surprised, she replied. But that admission matters even informally. It tells us where to look next. Where? Paper trails, she said. Leases, service agreements, tax filings. If a company is involved at that level, there will be documentation somewhere. I nodded even though she couldn't see me. And if we find it, I asked. Then we can assert a violation, she said, formally. There it was again. Formally. Everything about this process kept narrowing toward that word. This won't be a conversation, Gabriella, she added. It will be a filing. Once we move forward, your father and brother won't be able to ignore it. They already think I won't push this, I said. That works in your favor, she replied. People who don't expect resistance rarely prepare for it. I let out a quiet breath, because that part felt true. Daniel hadn't tried to hide anything. My father hadn't even considered that I would question the structure behind his decision. They had both assumed the same thing, that I would accept it, that I would move on, that I wouldn't look closely enough to see where the lines actually were. Okay, I said. What's the next step? I'll start drafting a preliminary review, Rebecca said. Something that outlines the potential violation based on the trust and the conditional deed. And me, I need you to keep building the factual side, she said. Anything that connects that company to operational control. Contracts, invoices, even local filings. Think like someone verifying a system, not challenging a person. That distinction mattered more than she probably realized, because it pulled me out of the emotional side of this completely. This wasn't about proving my father wrong. It was about verifying whether the structure he relied on actually held. I can do that, I said. Good, she replied. And Gabriella? Yeah, be careful how much you show them before we file. Right now, they're not taking this seriously. That gives us space. Don't close that gap too early. I won't, I said. After I hung up, I sat there for a while, not thinking about what I had lost, not even thinking about what I might gain, just recalibrating.
Because everything had shifted. The farm wasn't something I was trying to get back. It was something governed by a set of rules that had been ignored, and if those rules still applied, then this wasn't about convincing anyone. It was about presenting something they couldn't dismiss. The next few days moved differently, more deliberate, less reactive. I went through public business filings searching for companies operating in that region, cross-referencing names I had seen on the equipment with registered entities. It didn't take long to find a match. Midwest Ag Solutions, large enough to manage multiple properties, structured enough to have formal agreements, and based on their filings recently expanded. I pulled what I could: registration details, operational scope, locations of activity, nothing that directly tied them to our farm yet, but enough to establish context, enough to show that if they were involved, it wouldn't be informal, which meant there had to be a contract. I brought everything back to Rebecca 2 days later. She reviewed it the same way she had the first set of documents, quietly, precisely. When she finished, she looked up at me. "This lines up," she said. "With what?" "With a structured lease or operational agreement," she replied. "If we can tie this company directly to your brother's use of the land, it strengthens the violation significantly. So we're close." "We're getting there," she said. "But close isn't enough." I nodded. "I know." She closed the folder. "I'm going to prepare a formal notice," she said. "Not a full filing yet, something that signals we're aware of the conditions and the potential breach. To your father and your brother," she said. "It gives them a chance to respond before we escalate." I thought about that. "They're going to dismiss it," I said. Probably she agreed, but that response or lack of one becomes part of the record. Of course it did. Everything here was about building a record, layer by layer, document by document. "I'll send it once we finalize the language," she continued. "After that, we wait." "For what?" "For them to show us how they plan to handle it," she said. "And if they don't, then we move forward," she replied. "With everything we've built." I left her office with a copy of the draft in my bag. I didn't read it right away. Not because I was avoiding it, because I already knew what it represented. Not a question, not a request. A shift from observation to action. And once that shift happened, there was no going back to how things were before. That night, I finally sat down at my kitchen table and opened the document. The language was measured, precise. It didn't accuse. It didn't argue. It simply laid out the structure, the trust, the conditional deed, the reversion clause, and the indication that those conditions may have been violated. At the bottom, there was a single line that stood out more than anything else. "A request for clarification, not confrontation, just clarification." I read it twice. Then I folded it carefully and placed it back in the envelope. Because I knew what would happen when they received it. Not immediately, but soon. They would realize that this wasn't just me asking questions anymore. This was something else. Something structured. Something they couldn't talk their way out of. And based on everything I had seen so far, they weren't ready for that. The notice went out on a Tuesday morning. Rebecca sent it by certified mail and email, formal enough to establish a record, simple enough that it didn't look like an attack. We didn't call. We didn't follow up. We waited. For 2 days, nothing happened. No calls, no messages, no reaction. If I hadn't known better, I would have thought they ignored it. But silence like that usually means something else. It means people are trying to decide how to respond without showing that they're unsettled. On the 3rd day, my phone rang. It was my father. I let it ring once more than necessary before answering. "Hello. What is this?" Hector's voice was controlled but tight. "I'm assuming you're calling about the notice," I said.
You sent a legal document to my house, he replied. Through an attorney. Yes. There was a pause. You could have called me, he said. I could have, I agreed. But this isn't a conversation anymore. That landed harder than anything else I'd said to him in years. What exactly are you trying to do? He asked. Clarify something I said. The ownership structure of the farm. You already know the ownership structure, he said. I explained it. No, I replied calmly. You explained your version of it. Another pause. Longer this time. Gabriella, he said finally. You're overstepping. Am I asked, because the documents suggest otherwise. That's not how this works, he said. There are things you don't understand. Then explain them, I said. Silence again. Not because he didn't hear me. Because he didn't have an answer that fit both the facts and the version of the story he had built. You're making this bigger than it needs to be, he said instead. I didn't make it anything, I replied. I just read what was already there. That trust was put in place years ago, he said. Things change. Not without documentation, I said. Not when there are active conditions. His tone shifted slightly then. Less defensive. More direct. What do you want? He asked. That question used to matter to me. It doesn't anymore. This isn't about what I want, I said. It's about whether the current use of the land complies with the terms of the deed. You think you can just question everything because you found a few old papers. I think those old papers are still legally binding. They're not being violated, he said quickly. Then that should be easy to show, I replied. He didn't answer. Instead, I heard something else in the background. A voice. Daniel's. Muffled but close enough. What's she saying? My father covered the phone for a second, but not long enough. Then his voice came back sharper. This is unnecessary, he said. You're creating problems where there aren't any. I'm identifying them, I said. You're threatening your own family. No, I said quietly. I'm asking for clarification. The notice is very clear about that. He exhaled slowly. And if I don't respond the way you want, then we move forward with a formal review. And what does that mean? It means a third party looks at the structure, I said, the trust, the deed, the current use of the land, and decides whether everything aligns, and if it doesn't, I didn't hesitate. Then the terms of the trust apply. He didn't respond right away. But I didn't need him to, because for the first time he understood exactly what that meant. Not emotionally, structurally. Control could shift, not to me directly, but away from him, away from Daniel, and back to something they couldn't influence the same way. You're serious about this, he said finally. Yes. Another pause. Then more quietly, you're willing to take this all the way. I'm willing to follow the structure that was already put in place, I said. Nothing more, nothing less. There was no argument after that, no attempt to convince me I was wrong, no appeal to family, just silence. I'll review it, he said. Okay. And I'll get back to you. All right. He hung up. No goodbye. I set the phone down on the table and sat there for a moment. Not relieved, not anxious, just aware that something had shifted. Not because of what I said, because of what I didn't say. I hadn't asked for the farm. I hadn't demanded anything. I had simply made it clear that the structure existed and that I was willing to use it. 2 days later, Rebecca called me. They responded, she said, and they didn't deny the trust, she said. They didn't deny the conditional deed. My grip on the phone tightened slightly. What did they say? They argued that the current arrangement doesn't constitute a violation, she said, that the company is acting as a service provider, not taking operational control. I let out a slow breath. That's not what I saw. I know, she said.
And that's where this becomes important. How? Because now we're not questioning whether something exists, she said. We're disputing how it's being used. I nodded. So what happens next? We file, she said. Not a suggestion. A step. And then it gets reviewed, she replied. Formally. With everything on record. I closed my eyes for a second. Because this was it. Not the end, but the point where everything moved out of our hands. Do it, I said. There was no hesitation in my voice. Not anymore, because at this point it wasn't about whether I could stop this, or whether I should. It was about letting the structure do what it was designed to do, even if that meant unraveling everything my father thought he had secured. Even if that meant forcing a conclusion none of us had planned for, and based on the way they responded, they still believed they could control the outcome. They were about to find out they couldn't. The review didn't happen overnight. It moved the way most structured things do, quietly, methodically, without any sense of urgency from the outside. But underneath that stillness, everything was being examined. Rebecca handled the filings. A third-party reviewer was assigned. Documents were requested, submitted, compared. The trust, the conditional deed, the recent transfer to Daniel, the operational evidence we had gathered, and then the part that mattered most, the agreement with Midwest Ag Solutions. They didn't volunteer it. It had to be requested formally, which in itself said something. When the contract finally came through, it wasn't vague. It wasn't framed as consulting. It was exactly what it looked like from the field. A structured operational agreement. Defined responsibilities. Defined control over planting schedules, equipment use, labor allocation, and reporting. Not advisory. Not occasional. Ongoing. Material. I sat in Rebecca's office when she finished reviewing it. She didn't need to say anything right away. I could see it in the way she closed the folder. This crosses the line, she said finally. Not dramatically, just clearly. Completely, I asked. Yes, she replied. There's no reasonable interpretation of this that fits within the conditions of the deed. I nodded once. No surprise. Just confirmation. And now I asked. Now the structure does what it was designed to do, she said. The decision came 2 weeks later. Not from a courtroom. Not from a confrontation. From a formal determination. The conditions of the conditional deed had been materially violated. The operational control of the land had been transferred in a way that directly conflicted with the terms established by the Ramos Agricultural Trust. And because of that, the ownership interest held by my father and transferred to Daniel was no longer valid under those conditions. It didn't revert to me. Not directly. It reverted to the trust. Exactly as the clause had outlined. For a moment that might sound like nothing changed, but everything had, because the trust wasn't an empty structure. It had terms. It had beneficiaries. And according to the original documentation, I was the primary beneficiary once the prior interest was dissolved. Rebecca explained it simply. The trust regains control, she said, and under its terms you now have the authority to determine how the property is managed moving forward. Not ownership in the way my father had framed it. Not a gift. Authority. Defined. Structured. Limited in some ways, but real. I didn't go back to the farm immediately, not to celebrate, not to reclaim anything. I took time, not because I was unsure, because I wanted to be intentional. For years, that land had been framed as something to win, something to earn, something to fight over. I wasn't interested in repeating that cycle, so when I did make a decision, it wasn't about moving back. It wasn't about proving I could run it better than Daniel. It was about aligning with what had been there from the beginning. The conditions, the structure, the intent my grandfather had put in place. I hired a management firm, not to take over the land, but to operate within the boundaries the trust required. Clear oversight, clear reporting, no transfer of control, no shortcuts, everything documented, everything aligned. It wasn't the way my father would have done it, and it definitely wasn't the way Daniel had tried to, but it worked. Not just financially, structurally, sustainably. The farm didn't need to be controlled by one person's ego. It needed to be managed within a system that protected it. As for my family, we didn't have a final confrontation. No dramatic moment where everything was said. Because by the time the decision came through, there wasn't anything left to argue about. The structure had already answered the question. My father called once. A few days after everything was finalized. "I didn't think you'd go this far," he said. "I didn't either," I replied. There was a pause. "You could have handled this differently." "I did," I said. "For years." He didn't respond to that. Neither did I. We stayed on the line for a few seconds longer, then he hung up. Daniel never called, and that told me everything I needed to know. Not about who was right, but about what they had expected. They expected me to accept the version of the story they gave me. They didn't expect me to read the structure behind it. They didn't expect me to follow it. And they definitely didn't expect me to enforce it. But that's the difference between being told something and understanding how it actually works. I didn't win the farm. I didn't take anything from anyone. I just stopped ignoring what had already been put in place. And once I did, everything shifted on its own. For a long time, I thought boundaries had to be loud to matter. That you had to argue, confront, or prove something emotionally for it to count. But what I learned is that boundaries can also be quiet and still change everything. If you've ever been in a situation where family expectations didn't match reality, where something was framed as for everyone but felt controlled by a few, you're not alone. It's easy to question yourself in those moments, to wonder if you're overreacting or if it's worth pushing back at all. But there's a difference between revenge and clarity. Revenge tries to take something away. Clarity simply refuses to accept what isn't true. And sometimes that's enough. Forgiveness doesn't mean restoring access. It doesn't mean going back to how things were. It just means you're no longer carrying the weight of needing things to be different. You're allowed to step back. You're allowed to define your own boundaries even when they're not understood. If any part of this story felt familiar to you, I'd really like to hear your perspective. Have you ever had to question something your family insisted was settled? And if you want to follow more stories like this about boundaries, clarity, and rebuilding on your own terms, you're always welcome to stay. This is a fictional story created for entertainment, education, and reflection.